thanks so much for inviting me, and I apologize for having to reschedule this a couple of times, but summer is a good time to learn, but also a good time to build. So today I'll be talking about on-chain foreign exchange and cross-border payments. This is probably slightly dated from a paper from last year, but we try to update it, and we have a new draft that's coming. It's joint work with my colleagues from both Uniswap and Circle. You'll recognize some of the names here. And just the usual disclaimer that I used to give at the Fed applies, which I just made a typical disclaimer that the views expressed here are those of the authors and not necessarily those of the respective institutions we represent. So what is the motivation behind this? One is a very TradFi type of motivation. No, actually, both motivations are somewhat in the econ and finance world. First motivation is FX and cross-border payments are still somewhat broken. It's broken in the sense that despite having over $7-8 trillion per day of FX volume traded, something like half of it or 40% of it has substantial FX settlement risk, which means that the users are not necessarily protected if one of the parties goes default on the day of settlement. Two is the cost of remittance remains really high, especially for low value transactions. The World Bank estimated to be around 6% on average, and that's coming down slowly, but perhaps too slow. And it's essentially a tax on global transfers, especially for those who actually need the money the most. Second motivation is very much coming from the market microstructure literature on electronic exchanges, high-frequency trading. So Eric Budish at Chicago Booth have done a lot of work in this area, in which he studied how market makers are on this path of racing for essentially nanoseconds. And that access competition is either good for society, nor is it adding any gains, well, basically adding any social gains. The innovation here that I'll present on automated market maker, I think is quite different in that there's less of a competition for speed, rather it's a competition for liquidity through, for essentially putting up the liquidity in the first place as a pro rata share rather than fee distribution as a function of the speed to market. It's also broadly related to an earlier set of literature on liquidity provision by retail investors. So as a retail investor, you could place limit order type of trades. And you would think that, you know, obviously people use limit order because they think perhaps they can get a better price than the spot orders. But in fact, it turns out that retail traders almost always lose out by providing liquidity in the sense of placing limit orders. They always get picked off rather than actually benefit them from placing limit orders relative to spot market orders. So this paper really looks at the intersection between the space of automated market making or market microstructure and the usage of the automated market makers for the trading and settlement of foreign exchange. And the main takeaway is that automated market makers in FX could eliminate quite a bit of settlement risk, lower the cost of remittance, and facilitate price discovery, which is a more, I would say, more novel academic finding that I'll discuss later on in this presentation.
Can I ask a question on when you talked about limit order versus spot order? Is that's even considering the fee that they're getting? Even if with consideration of the fee, they're still worse off.
So the earlier literature on this study was just on I think retail brokerage platforms.
Okay.
So
Got
that's in equity market.
Okay.
So if your equity market placing limit order, I don't think you get fees for those limit order. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I don't get fees. And probably by the date of this study is probably actually back in the day when you didn't have zero fee trading So with zero-fee trading, maybe things are a bit different, but yeah. So let's just start from the basics of how FX transactions work. And there's a lot of details of how payment systems work. But I think the basic things that one needs to know is that settlement through FX, settling for an exchange transaction goes through multiple layers and multiple correspondent banks. The reason is, at the end of the day, it is an updating of some ledger. And the ledger that you ultimately want to update is a ledger on the central bank balance sheet. That is, who has holdings of the central bank liability in terms of bank reserves. Is it banks from this country or banks from that country? And because of how restrictive central bank balance sheets are in terms of who has access to the settlement system, the reserves, oftentimes you get a scenario in which a few large dominant banks have reserve accounts at multiple central banks, but not all of the central banks. And they had to exchange with each other and talk to each other to just to make the transfer happen and make the central bank ledger to be updated. So that requires not only a slow updating process of kind of propagating the message from the sender to the sender's bank to the sender's correspondent bank, and then ultimately to country B's correspondent bank, and propagate it back to the receiver. But there's also a messaging infrastructure layer, which essentially is Swift. Swift is not a payment settlement system, rather is a messaging layer that adheres to a certain standard that makes communication easier. But you can see how this is quite cumbersome because you had to essentially update so many ledgers in the process. And each of these updates are quite manual in the sense that even though some of the ledgers could be real time, at the end of the day, it still requires somebody pressing a button. Now, for this audience, I assume you know enough.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So for simplicity, all the cross-border transfer that people use with Swift and all this stuff, so the way that we can think about it, that Swift is kind of the communication between bank A and bank D or B, but not updating the ledger. Updating the ledger is going to happen in each bank separately in a different way, right?
Yeah. Well, there's multiple ledgers. There's the correspondent bank's ledger. There's the sender bank's ledger. Each of the bank have their own ledger, right? This is TradFi. And then the central bank has the central bank ledger. So the Fed has a FedWire system, which essentially, I think it runs on the Oracle database, but I could be wrong, of which is provider of the database. But essentially, then the banks have to talk to the central bank to update the ledger there. That say, ultimately, when you make that transfer, is bank A crediting bank B on some central bank reserve. Now, there are ways to get around it by providing credit and by kind of settling outside of the central bank system. But ultimately, if you net out everything, at the end of the day, it is a change on the central bank's ledger of how much of the reserve are held by one bank versus another. But the netting and et cetera, those are ways to speed things up, but those are also ways to actually create quite a bit of both credit risk, but also just liquidity need, because the banks also need to hold certain amount of funds to do nettings. To compare that with decentralized finance, where everything is atomic, even though this diagram might seem more complicated than it is, but the settlements are atomic, which in TradFi language, it's PVP, payment versus payment, or payment versus delivery. And that makes a huge difference in that the fund never leave the wallets of either the sender or receiver. There are no intermediary balance sheets other than some smart contracts. So perhaps if you categorize, say, AMM as providing the balance sheet capacity, you could probably make a balance sheet statement for the AMM. But other than that, it's really everything just reside in the senders and receivers wallet. I think that's ultimately what really makes a difference for DeFi, being considered as innovation, not in decentralizing governance necessarily or decentralizing, say, permissioning, but it's deleveraging intermediaries and deleveraging the usage of balance sheet. Of course, there are key steps in this process. One is the fiat on-ramp, off-ramp process, which is done by the stable token issuers. And now these days, our money market funds are also issuing tokens, but they're still not widely used. And then once the on-ramp happens, then everything is seamless through the DeFi architecture. And the off-ramp has happened as well, right? So right now, the state of play where we are is the fiat to on-ramp into crypto in dollar has been built out quite strongly, mainly by Circle and a few other players. And that banking connectivity is quite strong. But in the non-dollar currencies, we certainly lack the ability to on-ramp and off-ramp. EURC, which is another Circle coin, is probably one of the examples that is an exception, that it does have quite strong connectivity with the traditional fiat system. But really, it's hard to make those little connections because each jurisdiction have their own rules and there's own banking relationship that needs to be built up. So where does this come in for? So I think I mentioned this briefly earlier that tokenization and DeFi is, to me, is more about decentralization of balance sheet and deleveraging of intermediaries rather than decentralization of control. I think that ultimately will be what sticks out of all of this innovation. And I also think tokenization is about programmability. It's about on-chain data verifiability and contract enforceability, more so than just creating a bearer instrument token. Because if you actually read into how these contracts are updated, it is an account structure. Ethereum has these accounts. They're represented by the token, but essentially it's updating of accounts. That's a little bit different from, say, Bitcoin, which has a different architecture. Now, I'll skip over this, but one thing to mention is since the development of automated market makers have come online, and also the trading of payment stablecoins on AMMs have come online in the last several years, it has been taken notice by central banks. So the Bank of International Settlement, which is essentially the central bank for central bank, has experimented with Project Mariana, which is a automated market maker design using essentially their equivalent of stablecoin, which is called wholesale CBDC. So that's been a project of exploration, and I think they have newer versions of it currently being worked on. So I think it's recognized as a way to solve a real world problem that is at the core of international and global finance. Here, I'm just presenting a slide of, people talk about cost of transaction, using the AMM structure and on-chain transfers versus off-chain traditional rails. It was really never clear on the cost. So I just broke it down, at least try to break it down more on exactly where the fee costs are. And I come up with roughly an estimate of somewhere between, there's a fixed component, and then there's like a more variable component. The variable component are more related to exchange fees, which are, a percentage or a couple of bips of the transfer value. And then there's some fixed component, oftentimes related to on-ramp and off-ramp and things that you have to do for those, such as KYC users. So the on-ramp and off-ramp fees are actually not too prohibitive. Usually is, if you use a centralized exchange, it's usually 0% because it's being subsidized by the exchange. But even without subsidy, so standalone on-ramps and off-ramps often only charge 1%. Sometimes it's a fixed amount of, say, $5. which is relatively low if you think about the cost of remittance being on average in the 5 to 6% range. And then the DeFi infrastructure that's been built out also has been relatively low fee in comparison. So the network transaction fee, which is the gas fee, is probably the most expensive part, but layer 2 has made it much cheaper than before. And then the exchange fee, which is essentially either slippage, is probably a combination of slippage and liquidity pool fees. Here I'm taking it from some of the Uniswap protocol liquidity pools. It's usually just 1 to 5 bips, which is still substantial for institutions, but for small, medium enterprises, as well as just everyday retail users, those who are sending remittance, is actually quite substantially cheaper. So on average, we're looking at the cost of a saving probably of up to 80% using something like exchange on-ramp plus layer 2 DeFi for sending remittance in the main corridors relative to what typically are charged in traditional remittance. And so the traditional remittance costs come from the World Bank's number, and the DeFi and the on-ramp and off-ramp costs are from just what I mentioned before, observations that anyone could find.
Gordon, I think there's a question in the Q&A from earlier slides.
Sure. Let's see if I could see it. Do you mind?
Oh, I can. So the question it's do you see stable coins or CBDC? I think you addressed this a little bit. Do you see stable coins or CBDC more likely to be in this framework?
Well, I think I'm quite biased, right? So my background is I started my career as an FX trader a very long time ago. Did a PhD, and then I was at the Federal Reserve for a couple of years. Part of my role at the Federal Reserve was looking into developments in stablecoin and CBDC for international cross-border transfer, etc. Even though there was a really good team, very solid there, I think most of the team there, a lot of my ex-colleagues also realized that it's just hard to do innovation in a governmental type of structure. And I think ultimately the development of stablecoin and CBDC will converge to some extent, because if you think about what stablecoins are, well, it is trying to have the best collateral, the best reserve, that is government obligation as much as possible to be passed through, to be provided as in the form of token. So Circle right now have probably 90% of the reserve being held in governmental securities in the form of T-bills and treasury reverse repos. The goal, I think, eventually would be to hold 100% of it in government liabilities. Just this week, the BIS had one of the working papers released on reserve-backed token, which, if you think about it, that's very much like a stable coin, but it's backed by central bank reserve. The current issue is more about access to those reserves are traditionally limited to banks, which is a access issue that has to be discussed. But I think the CBDC space is developing, but it's developing really slowly, in part because of concerns for privacy that's really hard to overcome. And that's probably something that just, unless you're in a country like China, it's really hard to implement. So let me talk about this slide, which gets into a bit more about economics. So what are AMMs, right? There's a DeFi way of presenting AMMs as liquidity pools, as impermanent allows, etc. But for this audience of economists, especially those who have studied the basic level of graduate course microeconomics, AMMs are simply agents that could implement utility functions. And what is the simplest utility function that you could implement in an AMM? I think it's actually Cobb-Douglas utility function, which is essentially Uniswap v2. If you trace out the the constant product AMM bounding curve, that's what's called in the DeFi language, is essentially the indifference curve from a Cobb-Douglas utility function with a parameter of alpha equals to a half. So if you graph out the indifference curve, for a Cobb-Douglas utility function, and typically, you learn about trade-off of two goods, X and Y, or apples and oranges, and you can't consume too much of one versus the other. You have a marginal price of substitution between the two goods. Well, that marginal price of substitution is essentially the price of an AMM. So AMM functions just like the econ, I guess 201 level Cobb-Douglas utility function. That is in the simplest construction of a AMM. Of course, there are different type of bounding curve that represent different types of utility functions. And we can go through that a bit more, but what the more recent version of this constant of AMMs is having the flexibility to define specific utility curves in specific ranges, which is what Uniswap v3 did with concentrated liquidity. So it's really taking the utility function to the next step of defining arbitrary type of utility functions depending on the price range on which someone is providing liquidity for. So I hope that's clear. So this is an example of a constant product AMM. So for this group, I hope people actually know about this already, given the interest. But what is important to stress here is this is just no different than an indifference curve. So you're trading up two goods in a pool, and when there's an updating of the state after some trading, the marginal rate of substitution between two goods forms the price of that market. So the more meatier economic question is, how do you deal with adverse selection when price is updated? Price is updated when trade occurs, but a lot of the trade, I think last time I looked at it, something like 50 to 80% of all trade volume Uniswap are traded by arbitrage bots. That is, they'll observe some price elsewhere, and then they trade against the liquidity pool, against its DOM utility agent, which is oftentimes Cobb-Douglas, or even the more sophisticated ones are not super sophisticated. So there's a natural question of, the passive liquidity provider that have deployed liquidity in the pool gets the worst of the two assets constantly. And yes, they are being subsidized. They're being adversely selected, but they are getting some fee for their liquidity provision, which makes sense. So the fee has to be proportional to the amount of adverse selection. So if you think about adverse selection being a function of how much volatility there are and how much predictability in the directionality of the asset price there are, the fees are proportional to that adverse selection. So the profit function of a liquidity provider is then simply how much fee they could collect based on different fee tiers. That's the V3 version. I think in the V4 version, you can make the fees to be quite flexible. In fact, I just did a hackathon project on dynamic fee using forward-looking volatility. The higher the volatility of the pair, the more the liquidity provider should charge someone for their liquidity provision service. And the profit is essentially how much volume there is in trading times the amount of fees that someone gets for liquidity provision minus the divergence loss. So what is the divergence loss? Or it used to be called impermanent loss, but I really think it's more of divergence loss. Divergence loss is the loss that comes from the fact that the passive liquidity provider is always going to get the worst of the two assets. So as one of the assets appreciates, you're getting the worst of the two assets in more and more shares. So that leads to a loss relative to a portfolio that holds constantly the two assets. So arbitrage prices, as I mentioned, are enforced by the prices are enforced by arbitrage. So how does it work for FX pairs? So this is a graph on our paper in which we compare the Eurocoin USDC pair in Uniswap v3 against the Bloomberg Euro and USD fixings. And you can see that it actually tracks pretty well in terms of, these are like every 30-minute fixings on Bloomberg versus the Eurocoin USDC prices. And typically the difference are less than 5 bips, which is actually the amount in which you need to get over the 5 bips hurdle to arbitrage, because the fee in the pool is 5 bips in this pool. So generally it tracks well. The gray bars are weekends, which I'll talk about later. On the weekends, the TradFi FX market largely shuts down. So it's actually quite interesting to see that the AMM price keep on ticking, even though the TradFi market has effectively shut down. So this is probably the more interesting aspect of FX market, because it functions not 24/7, but say 24.5 days. Because after New York closes on Friday and before Japan opens on Sunday, you have this period of time in which there are essentially no FX trading on the market, and even Bloomberg doesn't give you a price for it. That's where I think AMMs actually come in, where you have truly independent price discovery. And what we plotted here is the return on the Uniswap portfolio, or the return from the Friday New York close to Sunday at noon New York time, based on the AMM price. That's the x-axis, and the y-axis is the predicted open of when from Friday close to Sunday late afternoon, which by that time Japan is already open in the FX market. So what this demonstrates is there's actually predictability of the AMM price that are traded on the weekend to where the FX market would open once the market actually opens on Sunday evening. What that means is there is quite a bit of independent price discovery. As information are impounded on AMM market during the weekend, these information are actually valuable, and that is facilitating new price discovery. And when the market opens up again, it's largely aligned with what one would expect in terms of new prices and new information that's being incorporated on the weekend. So I think it's important to highlight this because one of the reasons why AMMs exist is to facilitate price discovery. If it's purely there just as a reference price, again, for on-chain trading, as a reference to the off-chain trading price, then it's much less interesting. But it's because you have price discovery that embeds information that makes on-chain AMM interesting as a concept.
There's another question in the chat. What do you mean by divergence loss here is different? But what you meant by divergence loss here is different from Milliones et al.'s LVR, right? Lever.
Yeah. So the lever paper is really good. That is kind of a loss versus a portfolio that you rebalance, assuming that you could be the best arbitrager there is. That is, if you start out holding, say, 2 assets at, say, a price of 100, and the price of one asset versus the other falls to, say, 90, and it goes back to 100. So under divergence loss, you have no loss because the price went back to where it was before. Your pool went back to where it was before. You earn some fee in the process of trading, and there's no loss. So it's very much like a straddle option. You're selling the straddle almost, in that prices have shifted away, but it went back to where it was initially. But under lever, you would have a loss because lever is a benchmark against the best arbitrage scenario, in which if the price have fallen from 100 to 90 and back to 100, lever would have assumed that at 90 you would have rebalanced your portfolio and bought it at 90, and 100 you got back to where it was before, but because you bought it cheap at 90, then you would have made money from it. So that's a hypothetical loss. So I think that's probably a very strict condition, probably overkill to some degree, assuming the best of arbitrage. But it's really neat theoretically because it links to Black-Scholes, it links to a bunch of stuff that we know about options and hedging and etc. But the options and hedging market is also quite complicated because of some of the assumptions in academia doesn't work out in practice. That's why you see a skew in the option surface. You see discussions of local volatility versus just straightforward implied volatility. But that's a different discussion.
Can I ask a question? So back to your previous comment about the idea that DEXs works in the weekends, and maybe the activity can give some price discovery. So it's kind of interesting because the way that I will think about it is that mainly the most like informed traders, I guess, are the institutions which work in the week or I guess offline in the weekend. So like, what is your intuition about, like, it's basically gives some indication that maybe also small traders, or maybe there is a companies that now extend their trading and work in the weekends, like.
Yeah, my intuition is, this market actually functions to some degree, right? Like if you see a war breakout on a weekend, you might end up trading. You might not have many venues to trade. Actually, it's hard to find a venue to trade on the weekend. So you might just go to AMM to trade, say, Saturday evening, right? Of course, by Sunday, when the market opens, the price gets reflected. The TradFi traders wake up and they're like, okay, we got to update our price and update everything, and things get back to normal. I'm not so sure about how much of the institutional or TradFi FX market exists on the weekend. I don't think it exists in large quantity, if at all. Just by looking at there's no like price contribution on Bloomberg, for instance. Maybe there are some markets that's somewhat open, but it's not entirely clear. But the AMM price is just observable. Anyone do have access to it, so people do end up kind of trading it to some degree.
Interesting.
If I can start you on this page a little bit more, the magnitude we see on Uniswap return versus the TradFi return open, it's quite different, right? So, but there's a lot more variation in the opening price versus the ones that we see the price discovery during the weekend on Uniswap.
Yeah. So directionally, it's a positive relationship, right? Does the same magnitude get embedded on AMMs in terms of the price impact? No, but maybe because it's just lack of full price discovery or lack of full just embedding of information. So that's very possible. The other possibility is just maybe the liquidity isn't as good on AMMs as well, that at some point people are just like, well, there's no more gain to be had. Yeah, you made a great observation there. And I'll talk about liquidity in a little bit, which is also interesting because you actually observe that the weekend liquidity and the weekday liquidity are largely the same for AMMs, which is very, very different in the TradFi world, in which you have large swings in liquidity. So what we have is earlier I discussed, Cobb-Douglas utility agent being the first form of AMM. That just makes sense. Later on, there is innovations of more customized liquidity or range-bound concentrated liquidity, in which the indifference curve no longer follows a constant product function as it is in the earlier iteration, rather is a constant product function subject to a range, and the range are defined by price A, price B. So if you plug in this formula, you get a concentrated liquidity. So this is a diagram, I think, from the V3 paper, where you are getting a essentially a virtual reserve based on the price range of PA to PB, and within that range, you are getting constant product. Outside of range, there is no liquidity, but then that's anyone's position is defined by the range. So if you have many people who overlay positions together, you actually get perhaps very different shapes. So to go back to the diagram of price versus liquidity, so under Uniswap V2 or Kapitaka's utility agent, you have the same liquidity throughout. If you have a single position on concentrated liquidity, you get a bump of liquidity in a certain price range. But if you have a collection of different positions, you get essentially a distribution, which is more and more looking like a distribution you would get from market depth on central exchanges. What we see here, this is a screenshot I took of last year. There's probably more liquidity, more trading now, of EURC and USDC, two stablecoins that are both pegged to their respective currencies. And you see a lot of customized liquidity being deployed to this pool because of how jagged this is, which means it's not a single position, but rather a collection of positions. And you see, right, at least at the time I took this screenshot, maybe a year ago or two, you had volume that is, not substantial, 24-hour volume in the 1 million range, TBL in the 2 million range. I think it grew quite a bit more recently, but still it's relatively small. But what you do see is price discovery and liquidity provision that is immediately available once you have the different things in place, the on-ramp and off-ramp, the pool. I think just some people just deployed it because it's profitable. I think it's roughly the liquidity providers in the last year or two probably made high single digit or even low double digit returns just by doing reasonable ranges. So why do AMMs work? Well, it goes back to this average selection point. How much is their average selection? Are there average selection by the informed traders, and what is the informed traders holding period? I think relative to higher frequency trading, arrival information in lower frequency trading is more important in the spans of days and weeks. So if you're a liquidity provider that's providing liquidity for multiple days, multiple weeks, perhaps even months, then in that time range, there's less of an average selection. It's less of high frequency traders coming in and arbitraging the price, knowing that the price is going to be, or it's already a different price elsewhere. It's really hard to predict where FX price is, especially in the medium range, which is there's a long literature on predictability of FX price and how it's especially hard to predict in the medium range. And I think that works quite in favor of AMMs. So just kind of writing out a bit of what I discussed, it's hard to have informed trading in FX, in part because FX market is unpredictable, but also because I think it's related to the more mean reverting nature of FX prices, which are loosely related to uncovered interest rate parity. This is because FX price, FX return to some degree should be related to uncovered interest rate parity. That is how much interest rate, nominal interest rate are in one currency versus another. that should be some determinant of at least the expected change in the FX rate. Now, the interesting thing is that global interest rates are actually co-integrated. That is, if US raises interest rate or lowers interest rate, you often see Europe out doing the same, right? Right now, I think the ECB lowered the interest rate. The US is also considering doing the same. You could say it's because of a global cycle, a dollar cycle, or it could just be competition on the FX front for some countries. So regardless of the reason of why global monetary policies are synchronized, the result of that is you have the expected return in the FX space being linked more or less to interest rate, at least in certain terms, maybe in the medium term. And you also have a mean reverting nature of the FX rate. So there's a nice theorem from Grossman and Miller that if you hold the trading fee the same, the higher the autocorrelation in return, the more loss for market maker and lower the equilibrium level of liquidity. And that actually plays out in the AMM space quite well. So going back to the divergence loss, which was discussed earlier, if we actually estimate what the divergence loss in the FX space is, given if you plug in the regular FX volatility of usually less than 10% a year annualized, you're getting a divergence loss that is essentially quite tiny. So we're looking at a divergence loss that's very much in the range of just the fee accrual could overcome. This is quite different than the divergence loss you would see in something like ETH USDC or wrapped Bitcoin USDC, these crypto pairs, just because crypto prices are so much more volatile, right? I think the implied vol on Bitcoin and ETH are usually in the 70% annualized or 80% annualized rate, and sometimes the realized is could realize to over 100%. FX volatility are typically much lower. So given the amount of FX volatility, you really should see relatively low fees and relatively low divergence loss and more liquidity provision. So that's the point of linking it to FX.
Can I jump in? I think in general it's maybe true, but maybe it's worth to mention that it depends on the currencies, right? Because if you take a country that experience high inflation, Turkey, Argentina, whatever, so you can end up with the same volatility as Bitcoin and Ether. But the other way, the way to fix it is using your fee models in this very volatile FX market, right?
Oh, absolutely. For the more volatile currencies, you had to have higher fees. That goes back to the dynamic fee discussion. So if you look up on GitHub a project called Unicast, which is very related to it, dynamic fee, dynamic rebalancing. Also bear in mind that one of the issues is the tradings are of stablecoins. Stablecoins are zero interest, tokens by design. So if you're gonna hold a liquidity position of something that has high interest rate, over time, you're naturally gonna lose out because of the interest rate accrual.
Yeah.
That would lead to impermanent loss, or actually just permanent loss or divergence loss, because the currency that has a higher yield is expected to depreciate, right? That's what uncovering interest rate parity would tell you.
Okay, thanks.
Earlier I mentioned liquidity providers and how active versus passive they are, and how that passive nature of it actually makes average selection harder in the time range that we care about. And that actually kind of match up empirically to the behavior of liquidity providers. So if you look at liquidity providers, something like only 4% of liquidity providers are actively changing their position within an hour. right? The vast majority are changing their position, they're holding a position longer than a day. That is fundamentally very different than how a traditional market maker on a centralized liquidity limit order book looks like, because the fees are accrued on a pro rata basis for AMMs versus on a all or nothing, whoever comes in first gets the fee type of scenario for liquidity providers on the centralized limit order books. But that doesn't mean there's not active liquidity providers. There's still some. So this doesn't play. It's a GIF that's supposed to dance around. Credit to Alston Adams, who made that possible for these dancing graphs of seeing liquidity providers shifting their liquidity over time. The liquidity you observe on AMMs, I think part of the reason that regulators or central banks are interested in this sort of projects is the relative stability of liquidity. So flash crashes in FX is actually more common than imagined. Every once in a while, almost like every year or a couple of years, you have a major flash crash in the FX space. Usually that happens when markets are illiquid, such as after New York close, before Japan opens. There's very little liquidity in the traditional FX market, so prices get moved around. Sometimes on Sunday morning or Sunday evening when Japan opens, or Australia, New Zealand opens, is also quite illiquid. I actually remember the days when I was trading FX, and they're just tales of dealers saying to their junior colleagues, like, yeah, on Sunday morning, you just go through all the clients' book and try to move the price and hit all the limit orders if they have standing limit orders. And of course, you move the price enough, the limit orders will get triggered. But once they get triggered, you essentially like move the price back, by purchasing them. So that's like a way for some of the liquidity providers in the TradFi market to make money. You don't have that problem with on-chain FX, in part because the liquidity are more sticky, it's not flighting. So if you look at the fluctuation of market depth, which is a measure that I discuss in another paper, how do you calculate market depth on AMMs? That's a paper with Dan Robinson, where if you see plotted on average, it doesn't fluctuate much. It's like always around the mean. That is, whether it's on during the daytime or at night or on weekends, it's relatively sticky type of liquidity. That is quite different on the volume side. The volume does fluctuate quite a lot, sometimes going up to 300% of what the average is, and oftentimes falling back to like less than 100% of what the average is. So everything is normalized to 100, right? And these spikes are notable events. These spikes are typically, I think they typically happen around 8:30 a.m. in the morning when a lot of economic news come out. CPI number, for instance, non-farm payroll on Fridays, and etc. So particularly you have more volume trading, you'll probably also have more volatility during that time. So one of the design improvements is perhaps adding in dynamic fee such that you have a bit more control and more of the fee collection to liquidity providers at those times. So lastly, I'll discuss a few missing pieces and kind of open up also for more questions and discussions. Despite what I presented, which is kind of all great on the DeFi front, there's quite a bit of missing pieces to actually make on-chain FX and cross-border payments and cross-border FX payments a reality in a large way, because of lack of regulatory clarity on usage of DeFi is one. On things like identity solutions, if you're actually a TradFi organization that want to trade on-chain, it's really difficult to have both identity and privacy, because you want to preserve your privacy, not letting everyone know what your trades are, yet you also want to ensure that you're trading with regulated counterparties in the TradFi world. Custody service providers are improving quite a lot recently, but there's still some user friendliness type of stuff to go. Forward instruments is another. Vast majority of FX trade on a forward or swap basis. Right now, what you could only do is spot transactions. And of course, you have the regular MEM front running risk, which will make institutional adoption infeasible. But that's being actively solved by the DGens in DeFi and different ways of using separation of proposers and builders and etc. So I'll stop here, and I think I present a compelling case of using distributed ledger and DeFi for addressing a common FX issue and settlement issue and cross-border payment type of concern. I think it has a lot to offer for especially financial inclusion reasons, for remittance, for small, medium enterprises. But there's still a long way to go on the barriers. A lot of it hinges on regulation, but also on user friendliness. So